Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video for the 10th anniversary of the final game in the Ezio Trilogy, I'm going to be talking about my thoughts on Assassin's Creed Revelations, which over time has grown into one of my favorite games in the series. But when the game originally came out, I was someone that was obsessed with the Assassin's Creed series. I mean, I played AC1, 2, and Brotherhood over and over and over again, waiting for the next game to see the continuation of the story after this massive cliffhanger at the end of Brotherhood. And I remember my first experience with Revelations and ending up being really disappointed by it, which is such a bizarre thought now, as a lot of the things I hated about this game at the time are some of the things I've grown to respect. With it having this more open game structure, it has this more personal story, with this being a character study of this older Ezio. Now, I still don't like some of the new additions to this game, like the modified detection system, the tower defense system, the focus around bombs, the new control scheme, but those things aren't enough to negate everything that this game does right, which leads to it being one of the deepest and most satisfying narratives the series has ever told, perfectly wrapping up the stories of Altair and Ezio while progressing Desmond's character along the way. Now, along with the main game, I will also be talking about the Lost Archive DLC and the short film Assassin's Creed Embers, with me saving Embers for the very end of the video. But now, before talking about the game itself, I do feel like we need to talk about how this game was made. Now, Assassin's Creed is notoriously known for having annual releases, and through that, the public kind of got this misconception that most Assassin's Creed games were developed within the year that they came out. And while for the most part that simply isn't true, it is actually true for Assassin's Creed Revelations here, having an even more rushed development cycle than even the previous year's Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. Revelations was not a game intended to be made at the time of Brotherhood's development. Revelations started off as a 3DS game named Lost Legacy that would have involved Ezio traveling to Masyaf to learn the origin of the assassins. Now, that game was quietly cancelled, and those concepts were transferred over into Revelations here that ended up being developed in under a year. And I do think when analyzing this game, you can clearly tell that that is the case. Now, numerous studios did help with this game's development, but even despite that, the scale of this game clearly feels smaller than that of Brotherhood's, with a smaller open world and less side content as a whole. Also, more of the open world does blatantly reuse assets, with most viewpoints in the game looking very similar to each other. Also, narratively, with this game's modern day, you can clearly tell they were confined with what they were able to do due to AC3 already having been written and already well into development at this point. But despite all those things, Revelations really does rise above all of this, being way better than it has any right to actually be. And with that, let's start talking about the game itself, starting with the open world, where like in Brotherhood, the majority of the game takes place within one massive city, this time being Constantinople. And I know this game's open world does get some flack for not being as notable as the cities in the series before this, but I do really like this city. While not extremely notable in the grand scheme of things, I do like how the city flows together. Unlike Rome in Brotherhood, where there are these like hilly sections that are annoying to navigate through, Constantinople doesn't really have a section on the map like that. But as I said beforehand, Constantinople is not an extremely notable city from this time period, and that is something that I find fascinating about this game in comparison to recent AC games. Most current Assassin's Creed games, they seem to pick the setting first and then revolve a story around that setting. Revelations here does the complete opposite, where the story of the game was decided first and the city of Constantinople was used to boon that story. No one cared about exploring Renaissance Constantinople, but we end up going there because it makes sense for the story they are trying to tell. And current Assassin's Creed games simply don't do this. This historical tourism element of the series is now looked at as the series' identity, when in reality that's simply not what the series was meant to be. It was supposed to be about this assassin-Templar conflict and the philosophies behind them and how they are handled across time. But over time, Ubisoft themselves have changed this identity to appeal to a more broader audience, which all credit to them for doing so and executing on that. But for me, I do still prefer this older approach to the series, where the more story-based elements of the game were deemed more important. But from a gameplay perspective, I do enjoy traversing through this city, and part of that is booned by the addition of the hook blade, probably the most notable gameplay addition here in Revelations, where it allows you to slip down zip lines. It increases the distance of your jumps between buildings. It allows you to climb a lot quicker. I personally do like this addition to the gameplay, obviously making traversal quicker, but I do think it also waters down the series' core parkour system, and I can see how that can come off as underwhelming to AC purists. Now, the city of Constantinople doesn't really have any high points of elevation, and because of that, the viewpoints in this game do come off as pretty stale. Again, most of them are these really generic towers that are just placed within the world, and even the tallest building in the game, Galata Tower, was greatly exaggerated within the game to create a very high viewpoint for the game to have, as again in real life there simply just isn't one. And again, this all just bolsters this idea that this location was selected because the story necessitated it over the city itself being the game's main attraction. But speaking of viewpoints, that allows me to transition to a change within the game that I did find very underwhelming at the time, and still do now, and that is that Revelations is the first game to get rid of the initial control scheme that the AC series used to use, where the initial premise of the control scheme was to be a puppeteering system with the face buttons representing a part of the character's body, with this aligning with how the animus is supposed to function within the series. But in this game, we do get controls mixed around for the first time, namely the top face button, which used to represent the head and used to activate eagle vision or synchronizations. In this game, that is changed to the left stick, while the face button is changed to be a ranged weapon button, which always felt bizarre to me and was underwhelming that this is the point where we lose the original control scheme. Another change is the modification of eagle vision into eagle sense, where Ezio has supposedly mastered eagle vision now, and it turns into a worse version of it. I mean, I always hated eagle sense, where the game doesn't tell you your targets right away, you instead have to scan enemies. And while eagle sense does allow you to track enemies easier, that initial annoyance was enough for me to never particularly care for it. Now, the combat is pretty much the same from Brotherhood's. They did decide to add this slow-mo effect during finishers for some reason that really just feels like an annoying addition there. I don't know why they bothered with it. But again, with a new ranged weapon button, you can assume more of an abundance of ranged weapons, particularly bombs, which straight up feels like a gimmick added to this game just so the developers can say, hey, we changed something up here. But through that, we do get numerous types of bombs in this game and a pretty in-depth bomb crafting system that, I'll be honest, I never really took the time to fully learn, as I never really used bombs in this game, despite the game clearly wanting me to do so. Now for the side content in the game, which is a step down from Brotherhood, which in my opinion still to this day has the best side content in the entire series, but Revelations is still solid in its own right, improving upon certain ideas from Brotherhood while also having some tedious additions as well. I mean, just like Brotherhood, the city does have a renovation system where you can buy shops that increases your periodic income, but something I've always hated is how in this game they tied the renovation system to the notoriety system, where every time you buy a shop, your notoriety goes up, and the notoriety functions differently in this game from any other one in the series, where notoriety is known as Templar Awareness, and when the meter is full, the Templars can attack one of your assassin dens, which is a system that functions similarly to the Borgia Towers from Brotherhood. Though again, with the Borgia Towers, once you completed them, they were locked in. They were done for good. Here, Templars can potentially take back your dens, which leads to a notorious section in the game, which is the tower defense sections, which occur when you have to take a den back. And I always hated these sections when I was younger, but I've grown to be kind of okay with them. I mean, they still aren't great. Obviously, I don't play Assassin's Creed to play a tower defense minigame, but for one, it is avoidable if you do micromanage your awareness throughout the game, but also it is a very minor aspect of the game at the end of the day, so it doesn't really bother me too much anymore. But even then, there is a way to lock down your dens, just like in Brotherhood, and that is through the Assassin Recruit system, which does return from Brotherhood, but modified a bit. This game does have some specialized recruit missions that do add a bit of narrative to these missions and make them feel a lot less repetitive than they were in Brotherhood, where you would get the same occurrences over and over again. The recruits themselves are also a lot easier to level up in this game, And a lot of that plays into it, making it easier to make your recruits den leaders, which lead to a new type of side quests in the game, and that is the Master Assassin missions, where we see Ezio training these den leaders in taking down a particular target, and once these two-part missions are complete, that respective den is locked in and can't be overtaken by the Templars ever again. Now, for the most part, I do like the addition of these Master Assassin missions, as they do progress Ezio's character, showing him being a true mentor for the Brotherhood, and are missions that you can clearly tell the developers actually put some time into making. They're not your standard side quests that are just a copy and paste of previous material. Though something I don't particularly like is the fact that because these missions are split into two, after you complete your first mission, you do have to spend some time to level up your recruit another 5 levels before doing the second mission, which overall I found tedious, and I do also feel like it breaks up the momentum that these missions had going for it. Now, this game does also have its fair share of shoehorn side content as well, with faction HQ missions that are these one-off missions involving the factions within the game, and they're pretty forgettable. We'd also have book quests where we find hidden books throughout the city, and these are mostly boring as well, though I did like that you do get a cutscene after getting every book in the game, where Ezio takes Sofia to his library, though considering how much time it takes to get every book in the game, especially because some of them have to be bought at stores for ridiculous prices, I just don't really bother with it unless I'm going for a 100% completion playthrough. Now, to go along with the new bomb crafting system, we do also get these Perry Reese missions that teach us about the different types of bombs and give us these missions to make use of them. And to be honest, they are also kind of tedious. These missions really just come off as tutorials over being actual quality side quests, and because I never found them to be that fun to actually play. Now, the open world does have its fair share of collectibles, with the most important of which being the memoir pages, which when collected unlock a optional tomb within the Hagia Sophia, which is probably one of my favorite tomb missions in all of Assassin's Creed, and do lead you to getting one of the best armors in the game, in the Ishak Pasha armor, which in my eyes is one of the coolest looking armors in the entire series, fighting for that #1 spot of the armor of Altair, though I never particularly cared for the mask that Ezio wears most of the time when wearing it within the gameplay. Another collectible in the game are the data fragments, of which there are 100 within the open world, and while in the original game they are used to unlock the Desmond's Journey sections, in the Ezio Collection Remastered, they are simply just pointless and just there and don't lead to anything. But with that, let's talk about the final piece of side content here, and that is the Desmond's Journey sections, which are these optional modern day missions accessed through Animus Island that lead to these bizarre puzzle sections that do come off as pretty tedious, though through these we do get some much needed backstory on Desmond, learning about his childhood, being raised as an assassin, him rebelling and deciding to run away, seeing his early life in New York, and also seeing his development as a character, where he now recognizes the mistakes he has made and now vows to learn from those. And narratively, this is all really great, though it would have been a lot better if we were to actually play as Desmond during these events instead of having to do these puzzle sections that resemble these events. Now, in retrospect, knowing this game's development cycle, these sections also seem to be a consequence of AC3 already being in production, again making it tough to really progress the modern day in any real way, as AC3 obviously starts off where Brotherhood leaves off. So getting Desmond's backstory here does feel like them trying to make up for the lack of actual progress within the modern day, though it is something that I do feel like greatly boons the character of Desmond coming into AC3. And I feel like now is probably the right time to talk about the Lost Archive DLC, which takes what the Desmond's Journey sections do and improve upon it in every conceivable way. The puzzles are way more complex, I find the level design to be a lot more interesting, and it tells a pretty interesting narrative as well, this time focusing around the background of Clay Kazmarek, Subject 16, showing how he got recruited into the Assassins and how he infiltrated Abstergo. And towards the end of the DLC, we do get some major story revelations, which is pretty frustrating that they saved those for a DLC, but here we do learn that Lucy was actually a triple agent all along, truly aligning with the Templars, having spent the events of Brotherhood reporting back to Vidic in these messages labeled to William Miles, which is a really cool reveal. I think it's a pretty clear retcon from the events of AC2, but still interesting that it recontextualizes Brotherhood's modern day. But then we do also see his conversations with Juno, which were particularly fascinating at the time, considering how little we saw of Juno in Brotherhood and how massive of a role she has moving forward in the series. Like, I remember a lot of speculation after AC4 over Clay's association with the Instruments of the First Will and with him being a potential sage. Though obviously that was all for naught, as they just dropped the Juno storyline in the games. But considering how we had known about Subject 16 and his death since AC1, to get all this context around it here was really cool and is definitely the best part of this DLC. But now back to the main game, where it's time to talk about the narrative, which for me is by far the best in the entire series. I mean, the way that this game's story is able to wrap up most of the story threads from the Altair and Ezio storylines while also still adding intrigue to Desmond's character is pretty insane, making this a satisfying conclusion to the Ezio Trilogy and also providing one of my favorite moments in all of media. But to go along with that, this is also the first main series game written by Darby McDevitt, who I still consider to be the best writer Assassin's Creed has ever had and ever will have, and he does such a masterful job with Revelations here, writing this really deep and thought-provoking dialogue that explores the philosophies of the series in a way that we haven't really seen before. We see his impressive work writing compelling side characters, and he takes risks within the story that make this game stand out from a structural standpoint as well. Up to this point, and within most Assassin's Creed games, there is a central Templar antagonist that you spend the entire game trying to take down. While here in Revelations, that simply isn't the focus of the story. While Ahmet does become the main antagonist, Ezio's conflict with him is more of a side story to this game's more core character study of Ezio, this assassin mentor, now in the later portions of his life, having now realized how much he's given up in his life for the Creed, and him being disillusioned with it because of that, and with him finding love with Sofia and learning about Altair's life and the things that he went through. He's eventually able to let go of the Creed. I mean, he finds contentment with his life by the end of it, and it really is a beautiful way to end Ezio's story, giving him this really satisfying send-off here. Now, we'll be running through the game from beginning to end as well, and let's just start off here with the modern day, where right away we see that Desmond is put into the Black Room of the Animus after falling into a coma after the events of Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, leading to him awakening on Animus Island, being introduced to the AI recreation of Clay Kazmarek. And most of the modern day in this game, again, doesn't really progress the story forward, but it does its best to add more context to the current situation through these conversations we hear from William, Sean, and Rebecca, or through Desmond's journey, again, learning about Desmond's background, or these conversations between Desmond and Clay, which are all beautifully written. Again, really progressing Desmond's character with him being more open about the mistakes he's made in his life. But through Clay, we also find out that Desmond's mind is broken, having jumbled his own memories with that of Ezio and Altair. And to regain consciousness, he will need to find a sync nexus, the moment where he has now lived out all of his ancestors' memories in order to piece his mind back together. Which leads us to sequence 1, where we continue with Ezio's story 4 years after the ending of Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, where we find out that Ezio is traveling to Masyaf in order to find the secrets hidden in Altair's library. And this really gives us this awesome pre-rendered cutscene that shows his journey and his arrival at Masyaf. And while it is really jarring to go from this to the in-game graphics, which are significantly worse, this is just simply one of the best intros to me in the history of gaming. And to have the Revelations theme playing in the background as well, again, one of my favorite pieces of music in all of gaming, it really just makes this intro feel even more epic. I mean, you have Ezio looking like a badass as he's this one man fighting against this army of Templars. You have this great dialogue from Ezio setting up the game's premise. This intro really has it all in my eyes. Now afterwards, the rest of sequence 1 does take place in this set piece of Masyaf, where we do get the obvious tutorial sections where we're climbing up the fortress following this hallucination of Altair. We do also get the first carriage combat section, which I always hated as a kid. Obviously now I don't really have any difficulty with them. Now I understand how this section works, but when I was a kid, I would just get frustrated because I wouldn't understand why my carriage was just losing so much health at points. But even then, like, ideally, I could go without these sections in the game. We end the sequence by taking down Leandros, this really generic Templar captain. That leads to us heading to Constantinople in order to find the Masyaf keys that will allow us to open Altair's library. And this leads us to sequences 2 and 3, which mostly comprise of tutorials and introducing us to the new characters in the game, which I might as well mention this now, that while I do love how this game is a character study of Ezio, as this is the final game with him, I will also say that it is underwhelming that no other major characters from the previous Ezio games end up showing up here, making it feel like we never got a proper farewell to characters like Machiavelli, Leonardo, or Claudia. But with that said, these new characters here are also really great. We do meet Yusuf, this Turkish assassin leader, who's a really likable figure in this game, having this really fun dynamic with Ezio, though I do feel like he was kind of underutilized after these first few sequences. Suleiman was also an interesting figure in this game as well, especially through his dynamic with Ahmet, his uncle, who ends up becoming the main antagonist in the game. We then also have Sofia, who again is really likable as well, being Ezio's love interest and booting Ezio's character here, especially with the context of the Christina memories from Brotherhood. And here we do also get the first of the Altair missions, which through the keys actually being memory seals that contain Altair's memories, we do get to see major instances within Altair's life, and through using this storyline to relate it back to Ezio's, it really does end up greatly benefiting the storylines of both characters. And I do love this first mission here with Altair in particular, with it giving us this scene from before AC1 with some really great dialogue from the memory corridor with the target here, which is a specialty of Darby's. Again, Darby McDevitt is a master at writing these memory corridor sequences, where most of my all-time favorite memory corridor sequences within the series come from this game and from Black Flag. But after this, we do get to sequences 4 through 6, which all follow the same sort of structure, but that structure is radically different from what you would typically see from an older Assassin's Creed game, where the game does split each sequence into two storylines, this Suleiman storyline and this Sofia storyline. The Suleiman storyline revolves around working with Suleiman to track down the Templar leader in the area, who we assume is Manuel Palaiologos. And through this, we do end up investigating Tarek, the leader of the Sultan's army, who we assume is working with the Templars, only to kill him in sequence 6, where we find out that he was actually planning an ambush, which would lead us into Cappadocia in sequence 7. But for me, the real treat here is the Sofia storyline, where through this storyline, we obviously see Ezio's relationship with Sofia, but also each sequence is structured similarly, where we do get a mission for Sofia to find a book location. We do find the book that will give us a tomb location. We play through the tomb, which these tombs are some of the best in the entire series, with Form of the Ox in particular being one of my favorite missions in the entire series, with it being a non-stop chase after these Templars in a boat that does lead to some really fun parkour sections and a really dynamic set piece. But through these sections, we do claim the Masyaf keys, which ends with us getting more Altair memories. We do see Altair immediately after the ending of AC1 burning Al-Mualim's body and seeing this conflict between him and a boss, who in the next memory ends up revolting against Altair, taking control of the assassins after having killed Malik, one of Altair's sons, and Altair's wife Maria, which also, by the way, leads to a really dumb mission of running through Masyaf village with Darim, Altair's other son, and it's so easy to sink in this mission by getting too far away from him, even if he's like clearly in sight, which I always found that part of this mission really annoying. But after that, we do get to the final Altair memory, which narratively is probably one of my favorite missions in the entire series, where we see this much older Altair return to Masyaf years later. And while the gameplay is pretty slow, where you're essentially just walking your way up to Masyaf, it's still really great to see Altair take control back of the assassins. And I just love this confrontation with a boss where he kills him using the hidden gun, which he had created during his exile, having been obsessed with what he learned from the apple. And again, the memory corridor here with a boss is one of my favorite scenes in the entire series, with a boss learning the reality behind his father's death, and there being this minor reconciliation between him and Altair right before he passes. Now, at the end of sequence 6, with Ezio now having to follow Manuel to Cappadocia, we do have this really great mission of Ezio having to escape this blockade, which is another really fun set piece involving some great parkour sections of Ezio running through some burning ships. But that leads to sequence 7, which takes place in a city within a cave in Cappadocia, which is obviously a massive exaggeration of reality, where from what I understand, they did have underground cities, but not to this extent. But I did actually really like this sequence where we first assassinate Shakulu, Manuel's right-hand man, which is just kind of ridiculous that he survives Ezio's first assassination attempt on him, but we eventually assassinate Manuel as well. But in order to draw him out, Ezio decides to cause this massive explosion in the city, essentially dooming the entire city and killing a bunch of innocents, which when I first played this game, I really thought this was dumb, that Ezio forgoes the creed and is willing to let people die. I remember thinking that this is like a massive plot hole within the game, but now knowing the full context of his story, you do realize that Ezio again is disillusioned with the creed at this point, realizing how much he's given up to follow that way of life, and at this point he clearly doesn't care anymore, which does get further expanded on by the time of Sequence 8. But after killing Manuel, we do find out that Ahmet was the true Templar leader all along, which, I mean, is kind of obvious if you were paying attention through the story, but I did really like Ahmet. I know he gets a lot of criticism as being this boring villain, but I do like Ahmet's interactions with Ezio, where Ahmet provides a great dichotomy to Ezio, and he gets a decent amount of screen time to explain his convictions. Like, for me, there's an argument for Ahmet being a better villain than the more iconic villains in the series like Rodrigo or Cesare, who are both more cartoony, black and white sort of villains, where within the course of the game they are simply portrayed as evil without giving much context on why they are that way. While at least with Ahmet, again, we do get a lot of his rationale on why he is working against Ezio over the course of the story. But upon escaping the cave, Ezio does get another Altair flashback, this time showing him giving the final key to Niccolo Polo, who is the one that ends up hiding them. But through this, we do get this really great piece of dialogue that connects back to Ezio's story, where Altair says, "When I was very young, I was foolish enough to believe that our creed would bring an end to all these conflicts. If only I had possessed the humility to say to myself, I've seen enough for one life. I've done my part." Again, this is when Ezio realizes that it's okay for him to let go. He's dedicated his entire life to defeating the Templars, and with this, he ends up doing what Altair was not able to do, to be able to walk away from this conflict content with what he has been able to accomplish. But moving forward, with Ahmet kidnapping Sofia, Ezio has to go on one final mission here in Sequence 8, where everything from this point forward is fantastic. I mean, we have Ezio finding Yusuf's body, having given his life to save Sofia, to which we have Ezio giving this really great speech afterwards, wanting to avenge his death. We have Ezio and Ahmet's first physical confrontation, which, again, I really like this back and forth between the two, with Ahmet pointing out the flaws in Ezio's devotion to the creed. And this leads to the final confrontation in the game, where Ezio rescues Sofia and alongside her chase Ahmet down in another carriage chase, where eventually Ezio gets thrown off and has to use the parachute to continue chase, which I found this to be really annoying gameplay wise, where I would almost always end up crashing into the buildings. But we then knock Ahmet off a cliff, where we do get this ridiculous fight in the middle of the air as they're falling down. And this is essentially the final boss battle in the game, which I will say is pretty underwhelming. I mean, it is underwhelming that the Ezio Trilogy ends with this fight. Like, going from the Rodrigo fist fight and the Cesare boss battle to this is a massive downgrade. And Ezio doesn't even end up killing Ahmet himself, where Suleiman's father, shows up to kill him himself. And we then get Selim telling Ezio to leave, which I always felt to be underwhelming as well. Like, I don't mind that Ezio didn't kill Ahmet, as thematically I do think that works, but for me it would have made a lot more sense for Ezio to have just left on his own, over Selim forcing him to leave. And then showing Ezio being really upset by this. Again, I know that, again, Ezio being really upset by this, again, shows this newer, changed Ezio. But for me, it would have been a lot more satisfying to see Ezio just walking away from this conflict, not even caring, as I feel like that would have fit the game more thematically. But this does lead to the final sequence, Sequence 9, where right beforehand we get Desmond's last scene with Clay on Animus Island, as it's starting to get deleted, and we do get Clay giving Desmond his genetic memories before sacrificing himself. And I really do wish that they did more of this narratively. Again, AC3 was already written at this point, but they still could have added some references to it within that game. Instead, it's more so brought up in audio logs from Desmond after his death, where he talks about what he's learned from Clay there. But I still do find this to be a really great scene. Again, some really great dialogue there as well. But as for Sequence 9 itself, I mean, this is probably my favorite 15 to 20 minutes of any game ever. I absolutely adore every little thing that they do narratively from this point forward. I mean, we start off with Ezio and Sofia walking towards Masyaf, and during this we get some of my favorite pieces of dialogue in the entire series, where Ezio explains his interpretation of the Creed, which is one of the deepest explorations of one's philosophy we see in the series. Ezio does end up entering Altair's library, where he finds no books, no wisdom, just Altair's skeleton sitting in a chair with the final memory seal. And with this we get a final flashback where we see Altair's final moments of him placing the apple in the library. Again, all of this really great. The way the music builds up and the way the camera is used to transition from past to present is such a great touch here, and that alone would be incredible. But it's followed up by probably my favorite monologue in the entire series, with Ezio walking up to the apple only for him to leave it there, saying that he's seen enough for one life. Again, calling back to that previous flashback with Altair, and we have him then talking directly to Desmond, knowing that he's still watching him, as he has learned from Minerva back in AC2. And Ezio gives this speech with him essentially retiring as an assassin, with him acknowledging that his purpose was to be a conduit for Desmond, again showing his humility that Altair talked about, again realizing that he is not the one that will end this conflict. Again, such a perfect way to end Ezio's story throughout the games here, for him to understand the role that he is supposed to play, showing his development as a character. And that's really what makes Ezio as great of a character as he is. Because I've said this before, if you take Ezio's story from only AC2 or only Brotherhood or only Revelations, he isn't nearly as strong of a character to me as someone like Edward or Bayek, who have more satisfying single game stories. But through Ezio's character development that spreads throughout 3 games, that is executed so perfectly here, it really makes him an all-time great character in the gaming medium. But after we say farewell to Ezio, we then jump to Desmond in the Sync Nexus, getting this message from Jupiter, which is a great scene, though in retrospect it isn't necessary to the overall plot. Most of what he talks about here is already mentioned by Minerva or Juno in previous games, or is made abundantly clear early on in AC3. But through this we do also see this image of an Isu city being destroyed by the ramifications of the solar flare, and the game ends with Desmond awakening from his coma as they arrive at the Great Temple, which again is such a great ending to hype you up for AC3. And I remember how excited I was for AC3 at this point. To this day, I mean, this ending sequence of this game really is incredible, and stands out to me as one of the reasons why I love Revelations as much as I do. And that's pretty much it for the main game, but before ending we still have one more thing to talk about, and that is Assassin's Creed Embers, the short film that shows the final days of Ezio taking place in 1524, about 12 years after the ending of Revelations. And we do get to see a retired Ezio now married to Sofia with 2 kids, and we also get introduced to Xiao Jun, who has since become a fan favorite character that has become the star of AC Chronicles China. But I still think as a whole her potential as a character has been wasted, considering the fact that we still don't have an AC China game with Xiao Jun as the main character. But here we do see Ezio mentor Xiao Jun and later give her a precursor box that became the source of a lot of speculation over the next few years of what this box actually is. And we do eventually get the answer from the Chronicles games, but it's pretty clear that, again, that is a very clear retcon. And again, just feels like more wasted potential within the series. We do also get this great scene of Ezio returning to the plaza where his family was killed, and that felt like a full circle moment for him as well. But the main moment from this film that stands out is the ending, which is obviously this really beautiful scene where we do see Ezio going to the market with his family, and Ezio ends up sitting on a bench where he ends up dying as he smiles at Sofia and his daughter. And that's followed up by us hearing Ezio's final letter to Sofia, which again is so beautifully written by Darby, really summing up Ezio's arc once again, with him talking about love, liberty, and time, and that he's learned to value these things as he's grown older, and how through this he's found contentment in life. Again, really feeling like it, one, plays off of the ending of Revelations very well, but also just feels like a very satisfying farewell to his character, with like his goodbye to Sofia very much feeling like him saying farewell to us, the audience, as well. And with that, I mean, that is my thoughts on the ending of the Ezio Trilogy here. Again, Assassin's Creed Revelations and Embers both feel like perfect ways to say farewell to Ezio as a character. While as individual pieces of media, they simply don't work as well. While the context of what Ezio has been through AC2 and Brotherhood, to have a series wrap up a character's story this well is a rare feat within the gaming medium. I can only think of a handful of series that have given their protagonists this fitting of a farewell, and for the Assassin's Creed series to do that so early on is extremely impressive to me. And for them to also further connect Ezio's storyline to that of Altair's and wrap up Altair's story over the course of this game while also progressing Desmond's story makes it even more insane that Revelations is as good as it is. Now, Revelations is not without its flaws. I mean, many of them stem from the ramifications of its shortened development cycle, but Revelations is a game that simply shouldn't be this good. And I credit most of its quality to that of the writing of Darby McDevitt. And it's again, from a gameplay perspective, a retread of Brotherhood with some minor improvements, but also a lot of shoehorned in changes that felt like they were made simply to make it feel fresh, and very few of those things actually working for me personally, but its narrative is what carries this game and is what has made this game stand the test of time for me personally, to the point where now I think there's a serious debate for this being my favorite game in the entire series. But those are my thoughts on Assassin's Creed Revelations 10 years after its initial release. Again, another one in the books. Now, obviously, the plan for next year is to make a video on Assassin's Creed 3, so stay tuned for that. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.